So thank you everybody for being here. This panel is New Frontiers in Brazilian Queer Studies. And Jim, it is 25 years since you published Beyond Carnival. So it's kind of a very opportune moment to celebrate that book that really was changing in the field, but also kind of a megalith in my own studies and changing kind of my approach, because I was working in Latin America, Spanish America at the time, and turning towards Brazil, and that book just opened up so much. So thank you. With that, I'm going to keep my comments there and just say thank you. And we'll start. We have 3 panelists today. We'll go for about 20 minutes each. And Augusta will be starting from Brown University.
Can I do it from here?
Yeah.
Thank you, Jeremy. Let me put this here. So good morning, everyone. Thank you, Renan and Andrea, for being here as well. I would like to start this presentation by thanking Marina, Andrea, Rony, and all the undergrads involved in organizing this in terms of the logistics. And I would also like to thank, of course, Jim, first for accepting me as a student. And as you all know, and you witnessed last night, for being incredibly generous with me and my wife, Marta, who's not here, but wished that swapped places with my mom. So from the first time that I first heard/read you, I never again missed the chance of being close to you and your work, and never ever take your advice for granted ever since. So it's not an accident that I ended up working with LGBTQ history, and having you as a mentor and a friend is the thing that I value and cherish the most in my career. I am an historian now conducting my doctoral research on lesbian life in 20th century Brazil here at Brown under Jim's supervision. I am a lesbian doing lesbian history, which is sometimes odd, but Jim told me it's possible, so I believed him. I had prepared a presentation on something completely different about archives, lesbian history, and commemorative dates, but I will have plenty of time throughout my career to talk about my research. It's hard to surprise Jim, and I don't like to keep secrets. And Jim knows everything that will happen beforehand, as you all shared last night. But what Barbara Weinstein and Isadora did yesterday really inspired me to do something completely different, starting at 6 p.m. last night, when I broke into Jim's office to steal a copy of Beyond Carnival. And to talk about what I think is Jim's contribution to the field of LGBTQ history in Brazil and the way his work impacted my own scholarship. I remember reading the book about 10 years ago while still in undergrad in Porto Alegre at URGS, Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul, and thinking, how did he write this? He's a genius, I need to meet him. And I then proceeded to follow him around for the next 5 years or so until I got into the program at Brown. And before formally meeting him in 2015, when I was 21, in my master thesis prospectus about the history of the travesti and transgender movement in my hometown, Porto Alegre, I devoted a whole page to Jim's writings in the State of the Art section, from which I translated a piece and quote here. So it's my master's prospectus, bear with it. 10 years ago. The work of James Green, Beyond Carnival, is different from the scholarship on sexuality in the field of social medicine anthropology produced during the 1990s, and it is an important addition to the incipient scholarship on the topic in the historical discipline. Green takes the beginning of the 20th century in the cities of Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo as a starting point to a history of the category homosexual and the place it occupies in society, as well as the subculture that emerges from spaces where male homosexuality flourishes. The author shows that there is a common identity between men who sought other men, attentive to class and race differences, and also discussing the dichotomy of the active/passive in homosexuals in the Brazilian context. Green's analysis is crucial because it questions the hegemonic discourse of police repression and medical knowledge by also examining oral narratives and press sources from the 20th century. Green's work, then, fills a historical gap of understanding the origins of categories related to sexuality, as well as the influence of social and historical processes on the perception of homosexuality across time. I knew then that Jim's work was very influential, and I wanted to meet him so bad, and I saw him across several packed lecture halls, never got a chance to talk to him. And in this prospectus, I proceeded to then discuss Jim's work in the intersection of carnival and gender, which at the time resonated with my research on travesti and transgender women in the 1990s, especially in terms of how gender-bending practices contributed to a broader understanding of gender and sexuality as intertwined categories of analysis. While my analysis at the ripe age of 21, straight from undergrad, might have been a bit superficial, Beyond Carnival have influenced not only myself, I dare say, but all scholars working with LGBTQ plus history. And from what I heard from Jim, other people who were struggling with their identity and sexuality at the time have also come forward to him saying that the book was crucial for them to accept themselves and to come out. And if you're familiar with the field, you know that the book is foundational for the history of sexuality in Brazil. And as the years have passed, I returned to the book several times, I still do, sometimes stealing from Jim's office, but I have several copies. And every time I discover something that I didn't know or establish a new connection with it, what Beyond Carnival does is inaugurate a new way of looking at LGBTQ plus life in the past as not simply marginal, but as a part of a broader context that articulated desire, social norms, and political change. As Jim himself says in the book, it is a bridge between historical analysis of the medical legal discourses of the 1930s and the anthropological studies of contemporary Brazilian homosexuals. Though Jim claims he didn't read Foucault to write this book, it is inevitable to draw comparison between the medical and legal discourses of the 30s that Jim analyzes and the way they influenced ideas about homosexuality and its stigmatization. It is a social history of male homosexuality, because it traces the existence of a homosexual subculture back to the 19th century. Even before the invention of the term homosexual, it follows people, discourses, and ideas about male homosexuality and the way men engaged or didn't with these ideas. It is different than other works that appeared in preceding years in the field because it's not a mere list of possible gay men and evidence to support it, as others have done, but explores homosexuality's role in the Brazilian family structure, how men negotiated with the norm and appropriated events such as Carnival, which increased public awareness about elements of homosexual subculture. In some ways, it is also a history of emotions, because Jim conducted 70 interviews with men who lived in different circumstances and had to deal with their sexuality, and also navigate other spheres of life. What I think is the most important contribution, though, is how Jim historicizes the fluidity of sexual desires, identity, erotic praxis, which not only challenged heteronormativity, but also challenged ideas about active, passive same-sex behavior, the Boff-Bicha dichotomy. Men's lives were much more interesting, even before the emergence of a unified gay identity, and a same-sex erotic subculture existed in Rio and São Paulo prior to the invention of the term homosexual and the importation of European medical moderns that cataloged sexual pathologies and deviant behaviors. Multiple sexual systems have coexisted and interacted throughout much of the century, and he advises historians that should be aware of identifying the allegedly more egalitarian model of same-sex activity with progress, always aware of the contemporary gaze on historical sources. Though the book ends with the emergence of the gay and lesbian movement in the late 70s, Jim's own experience and participation in the movement meant that his writings went on to analyze that particular period later on. I will now move to where our interests intersect. My dissertation research here in Brazil, which is still underway, consisted mainly in tracing Jim's footsteps almost 30 years ago to find, instead of gays, lesbians throughout the 20th century in Brazil. Since there are no comprehensive studies of lesbian life in Brazil yet. Early on, it became clear that the scope of this project presented enormous methodological challenges. While gay men took advantage of public spaces such as parks and squares to meet at night, women's different socialization oftentimes prevented them to be out in public alone without a family member, meaning that most of these relationships were private and sometimes even deemed less harmful than gay men's relationships by society, only if they could find husbands and be cured, of course. But tracing Jim's footsteps proved more useful than not. He introduced me to all the people he thought could help my project. And his sharp memory has helped me to get a sense of the political climate that enabled the emergence of the homosexual movement. And his own closeness with lesbian feminist activists meant he had a unique point of view on the movement. I went to the archives he went to, examined the same collections he did, and sometimes found absolutely nothing, just like he said might happen, which pushed my research in different directions than his. Other times, Jim himself shared invaluable sources with me, which now constitute the backbone of most of my dissertation. Numerous medical and legal treatises on sexual inversion, periodicals from the alternative press, people that I could possibly interview, clippings from old newspapers. My dissertation draws on media and press sources, medical texts and records, letters, literature, official documents from institutions, court cases, and social movements organizations, lesbian publications and our interviews. While he said I would have to be very, very creative, he stated, with the sources, and extract from them as much information as possible, the way he conducted his own research and passed down the knowledge and experience to me meant that I knew where and what to look for. He had fully prepared me to take risks and sometimes fail, which I did. But for the past 4 years, I've had the joy to call him a few times just to say, hey, I found a new incredible source. Just to hear him say, see, I told you. Because of this extensive research, though lesbian invisibility has been a common trope in historical narratives, I propose in my dissertation that lesbians were not invisible, an invisible marginalized group in 20th century Brazil. Rather, lesbians were integral to hegemonic discourse on social normativity, acting as foils for ideas of attainable femininity and as models of undesirable masculinity. I foreground the essential roles of lesbians to cultural and social development in Brazil, in music and literature. Moreover, I explore how, instead of being passive individuals marginalized by society, lesbians actively engage with and challenge heteronormative discourse. This was also influenced by Jim's work, who, throughout Beyond Carnival, showed how homosexual subculture intersected with normative discourse about sexual deviance and morality, including medical legal ideas. This is a story of women and their sociability, but not only. It is a history of the discourses about female homosexuality, how the media portrayed them, how they were targeted by repression, and how a politicized lesbian subject emerged in the late stages of Brazilian dictatorship, culminated in a strong and lasting lesbian movement that demanded rights and recognition. It also pays attention to differences in class and race among these women, which certainly influenced the way that they were perceived for their desire. Ultimately, it seeks to map out the emergency of a collective lesbian identity that mobilized the discourse of redemocratization to forge ties and kinship among these women, but also the difficulties that the process entails. In some ways, it overlaps with a broader history of homosexuality, considering parallel sociabilities and marginalization as common threads among both men and women who lived as gay and lesbian throughout the 20th century. I later had the privilege of reading Beyond Carnival's third and latest edition while Jim was still working on it. Though many histories of sexuality have been written in subsequent years, especially on the homosexual movement and press, and attentive to questions of race and gender, making it a field that is flourishing with new research, Beyond Carnival still stands out as one of the most inspiring, thought-provoking books in the field. It answers a lot of questions about how gay men lived fulfilling and somewhat liberated lives, even through hardship and difficult political and social climates. But it also shows that numerous identities and practices coexisted, were influenced by normative powers and by other social markers, which complexifies the history of male sexuality in Brazil and poses new questions. I would like to conclude by saying that working with Jim has been the greatest honor and privilege of my life. I fondly remember him saying, after our first meeting, in one of those days in someone's lifetime that absolutely changed everything, that he had been looking for a person to do lesbian social history for 25 years, and he thought that the person was me. I'm still working on it, as you can see. Forever indebted to the path that he paved us, for us LGBTQ plus scholars who venture into the study of the history of sexuality in Brazil. Thank you.
Thank you, Guta. Andrea Allen from the University of Toronto.
Let's see.
So I want to thank Ronnie Wine for the logistics of helping me get here, and also Jim for being an inspiration. And I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. The other sheep in this case are LGBTQ Brazilian evangelicals and Pentecostals who stand betwixt and between as negotiators with evangelical and LGBTQ communities in Brazil. Sorry. Finding full acceptance in neither community, Their negotiations occur not only in public and political spaces, but with their families, communities, and individuals who sometimes have deep investments both in evangelical Christianity and greater freedom for LGBTQ persons. Before I discuss my current research project, I'd like to discuss how this project is a culmination of my various research interests and ethnographic projects that I've conducted in Brazil, the US, and Portugal. I conducted my first ethnographic project while I was an undergraduate student studying abroad in Brazil. I interviewed lesbian, gay, and transgender practitioners of Candomblé in Salvador. And one of my main objections was to examine why it seemed that there was a religion that not only tolerated, but accepted and fully integrated its LGBTQ practitioners into the fold. As a master's student, I still focused on religion, but I turned to the experiences of evangelical and Catholic Brazilian women who were immigrants to the United States. Although these projects focused on different religious communities, they share a foundation in that they both investigated populations who have experienced different forms of marginalization and stress. My next research project was a departure from the previous two in that I did not focus on religion and instead turned my attention to the experiences of lesbian women in Salvador. For my dissertation research, and Jim was on my dissertation committee, I focused on the experiences of primarily Black lesbian women in Salvador, and even more on the thorny issue of intimate partner violence in lesbian relationships. In my book, Violence and Desire in Brazilian Lesbian Relationships, which was based on my dissertation, As I mentioned, I discuss intimate partner violence, sexuality, sexism, homophobia, the religious beliefs of the lesbian women I interviewed, as well as I'm missing a page. Here it is, sorry. And their experiences with intimate partner violence and discrimination. This professional genealogy provides a framework for understanding how, for me, my current book project, which I have entitled Other Sheep Not of This Fold, LGBTQ Evangelicals and Pentecostals in Brazil and the Brazilian Diaspora, represents an intersection of my research interests. I conducted ethnographic research at an inclusive evangelical church in São Paulo and in Lisbon for 6.5 months between 2016 and 2023. One of these churches is the Igreja Nova Esperança in São Paulo. During this time period, I attended church services, conducted interviews, and interacted with congregants and the leadership staff. I interviewed 21 New Hope members, including the founding pastor of the church, Pastor Justino, and 3 other ministers. Of these interlocutors, 7 self-identified as white, 4 self-identified as moreno or pardo, and 10 self-identified as negro. For the sake of time, I will not provide a further breakdown of the demographic profile of New Hope, but I can do so in the Q&A for those interested. In addition, I interviewed 52 LGBTQ Christians who are members of Cidade de Refúgio, City of Refuge Church in Sao Paulo and Lisbon. In my interviews, we discussed racism, sexism, their religious beliefs and theological beliefs, and their political perspectives. Based on analysis of my ethnographic data, I will discuss one of my major findings in the presentation, and today I will argue for the wonky potentiality of Black queer religious hermeneutics within the context of LGBTQ-led evangelical churches. Black LGBTQ evangelicals are enmeshed in a social, religious, and political landscape that is often in a blatantly adversarial relationship with them. They experience structural, physical, and political violence as an everyday reality. One major consequence of the outright condemnation of LGBTQ Christians by the larger evangelical community is that the former have established their own churches, Igrejas Inclusivas Evangélicas, which are rooted in evangelical Pentecostal and neo-Pentecostal traditions. In these churches, LGBTQ Afro-Brazilians attempt to reconcile a literalist approach to biblical interpretation with their belief in an inclusive theology that accepts same-sex sexuality and transgender and non-binary gender identities. Yet, as I will illustrate, this Black queer religious hermeneutical approach can produce difficulties for those believers who attempt to negotiate with traditionalist understandings of the Bible, like the mandate to obey God's will, for example. These difficulties or wonkiness, to draw on Sarah Ahmed's discussion of queer phenomenology, can reveal how Brazilian evangelicalism is a religious space that is oriented toward and around whiteness and heterosexuality, despite the participation of LGBTQ believers of African descent. Their negotiations disturb queer theoretical frameworks that emphasize resistance and empowerment. Such emphases can foreclose analytical possibilities in a myopic attempt to focus on queerness as the orienting experiential framework of sexual and gender minorities. Instead, this analysis of Afro-Brazilian LGBTQ evangelicals offers the possibility for extending the roles of religiosity and materiality as the primary grounds of analysis, eschewing an over-reliance on abstraction and subversion as analytical frames. The central focus of the analysis in this presentation will be a sermon I heard in 2016 about the biblical figure Hagar, who has inspired much discussion within academic and theological communities across the Abrahamic religions. In an article I just recently published, I focus also on interviews, but for the sake of time, I'll just focus on this sermon. Hagar, the enslaved Egyptian servant of Sarah, wife of the Hebrew Bible patriarch Abraham, has been positioned as the other, the oppressed, the marginalized, and as a survivor. Yet in the summer of 2016, I heard a sermon given by Pastor Flavio, a black gay man in São Paulo, that essentially described Hagar as a talented breeder. Here's a picture of New Hope in one of their earliest church establishments, and then also Justino Luiz, who was the founder of the church. As I processed and analyzed the interviews I conducted, the field notes I took, and my observations from church services I attended, I began to consider the inevitable tensions that arose between evangelicalism, race, and non-normative sexualities and genders. Often interlocutors lamented their inability to remain within mainstream evangelical spaces, which prevented them from full participation in their church homes. These experiences are similar to what we read in other scholarship about the experiences of LGBTQ Christians, especially evangelical Christians from around the world. Accordingly, it seems warranted to characterize evangelical spaces as phenomenologically heterosexual, as well as, depending on the geographical context, white spaces that are oriented toward and around white racialized bodies. In queer phenomenology, Sarah Ahmed theorizes that bodies become orientated by how they take up time and space. When bodies are queered, whether racially and or sexually, they disrupt the conventional orientation of spaces and produce disorientation, which can lead to wonkiness, according to Ahmed. I argue that this wonkiness is present at New Hope and other Brazilian inclusive evangelical churches. It is important to state that I recognize that this argument implicitly draws on my own reactions, experiences, and background. It would be impossible, of course, to disconnect my own analysis from my experiences. As a black queer woman who grew up in the Black Baptist tradition in the United States. As I've analyzed my ethnographic findings about Brazilian LGBTQ evangelicals, I've undertaken a theoretical journey that I believe, in fact, has been enriched because of the disorientation that I at times experienced while conducting field work. As I developed my analysis and gathered more data, it became clear that wonkiness could be a generative analytic as I articulated the negotiations and reconciliations that factor into Afro-Brazilian LGBTQ evangelicals' engagement with Christianity. The disorienting effects or queer effects of Black queer evangelicalism was more than a personal experience for me, as I will demonstrate in a discussion of a Black gay man's sermon about Hagar. And this is Pastor Flavio. It was at the downtown location in 2016 where I heard one of the ministers, Pastor Flavio, give a sermon that focused on Hagar, the slave of Sarah, the wife of the biblical patriarch Abraham. This biblical narrative focuses on issues dealing with gender, power, reproduction, and obedience. For Pastor Flavio at New Hope, obedience was the most prominent lesson to be learned from Hagar's experiences. Before he focused on the lesson of his sermon, Pastor Flavio described the situation of Sarah and Abraham, as well as Hagar's role in fulfilling God's promise to this couple. He discussed Sarah's state of barrenness, which necessitated that someone else, Hagar, carry a child on her behalf. According to Genesis, Hagar was given to Abraham by Sarah to procreate and be a carrier for her mistress. Pastor Flavio noted that once Hagar became pregnant, she became uppity towards Sarah, which he then suggested was the reason that Sarah began to treat Hagar poorly. As the result of this mistreatment, he noted that Hagar left Abraham's household, but eventually returned to give birth to Ishmael in obedience to God, and after being visited by the angel of the Lord. While there is more to the Hagar narrative in Genesis, Pastor Flavio's focus was almost solely on Hagar's duty to Sarah and Abraham. In his view, it was her God-given talent to be a surrogate or the designated carrier in Sarah's stead. He argued that Hagar did not fully accept her responsibility, which was demonstrated in her attitude towards Sarah. In sum, the message for the congregation was to use the gifts that God has given us in the fulfillment of his will and with a spirit of humility. The minister who gave this sermon, Pastor Flavio, is a self-identified black gay man in his mid-30s and the husband of Pastor Justino. Pastor Flavio is unlike most of the congregants I interviewed in that he was raised in the Catholic Church and educated in Catholic schools. I learned about Pastor Flavio's life 3 years after he gave the sermon when I returned to São Paulo in 2019. While a choir practiced for the afternoon service, we talked after a Sunday morning service in a cramped storage room next to the sanctuary. After asking him about his early experiences with religion, I inquired about this sermon. 3 years ago when I was here, I remember that you preached about Hagar. I don't know if you remember that sermon. For me, it was interesting to think about her. Could you talk about the significance of Hagar for you? Pastor Flavio immediately answered and said, Hagar was a wonderful experience in my life. Hagar for me today, if I could summarize, is about obedience. For me, it is about obedience because we have to seek out living the gospel, especially those of us who preach the word. As he spoke about the significance of this sermon for him, he repeatedly emphasized the theme of obedience, which was the message Jesus ministered to him or put in his heart, he said. Thus, the message was not only for the congregation, but for him as well, and a part of his preparation was searching for how to apply this to his life, end quote. As we continue to talk about the sermon, Pastor Flavio retrieved his cell phone from his pants pocket because he kept sermon notes on it. Finding his notes, he said, I began speaking about the question of appreciation because sometimes when we look at Hagar, and in the Bible itself, it identifies Hagar as a slave. She is a slave and much more. I began to appreciate her because this ability to reproduce has a certain importance. Additionally, Pastor Flavio stated that Hagar being chosen as a surrogate was an indication of how she was valorized despite her status as an enslaved woman. Pastor Flavio also noted that just like domestic workers who were nowadays treated poorly in Brazil, he hypothesized that Sarah also mistreated Hagar. In discussing Sarah's mistreatment, he stated, so you see that even though she knew that she was having a child for Sarah, she still obeyed because she could have done a little something even though she was a slave. I'm going to do a little something to not give that pleasure to my mistress who mistreats me, you understand? From his perspective, Hagar had some agency in that she could have hindered attempts to produce an heir for Abraham and Sarah. He did not make clear how exactly this was the case. In response, I asked Pastor Flavio, since Hagar was a slave, how was it possible for Hagar to have freedom? So between obedience and freedom, what is the situation? What is the choice for Hagar? After Pastor Flavio stated that he didn't understand my question, I rephrased it. Now understanding, Pastor Flavio stated, so you were asking, is it possible for her to choose freedom when in reality she is a slave and doesn't have the power to make decisions? Exactly, I said. Pastor Flavio softly laughed and said, look, it's difficult. In both Pastor Flavio's sermon and in his interview with me, he employed a traditional evangelical hermeneutical approach. Hagar's duty is to obey the will of God, and her obligation of surrogacy is a reminder that our bodies are not our own, but in essence the property of God, and that fulfillment of his will for us and our bodies is paramount. Thus even Hagar, an enslaved woman, had the ability to choose and therefore obey because she could have avoided pregnancy as a vindictive response to Sarah's mistreatment of her. However, it should be noted that Pastor Flavio only referenced Sarah's behavior towards Hagar, and not the fact that regardless of Hagar's ability to prevent pregnancy, she was still required to have a sexual relationship with Abraham, her mistress's husband. Thus, obedience and not sexual violence was the focus of Pastor Flavio's sermon and his comments to me. New Hope is an inclusive church rooted in evangelicalism, and Pastor Flavio's Black queer hermeneutical approach to his Hagar sermon lines up with dominant evangelical conservative or traditional theologies that emphasize obedience and faithfulness. Yet it is also necessary to consider the ramifications of this sermon within the context of LGBTQ-led churches that have many Afro-Brazilian congregants, particularly as it was a sermon preached by a minister who is himself Black and gay. If it was difficult for Pastor Flavio to reconcile fully his focus on Hagar's obedience with her enslavement, would it also not prove difficult for other members of New Hope? Furthermore, Pastor Flavio's difficulties invite a discussion of the misalignment between his and dominant evangelical theology. Despite Pastor Flavio's mostly traditional evangelicalism, his very identity as a Black gay man implicitly reflects his failure to embody fully whiteness and heterosexuality, the orienting ideologies within Brazilian evangelical spaces, I would argue. On one hand, it is both a strategy and a theological choice to attempt to divorce his interpretation of the Hagar narrative from the historical, political, cultural, social, and religious landscape of Brazilian society. On the other hand, Pastor Flavio did admit that it was difficult to explain Hagar's freedom amid enslavement. He attempted and failed to align Hagar's rape and expulsion and focus on the glory of God and obedience to his will. The statement, "Look, it's difficult," acknowledged the ambiguity and contradictions of Hagar's positionality as well as his own, revealing the possibilities that could arise when bodies that are queer as well as Black engage with evangelical orthodoxy. By focusing on Afro-Brazilian evangelicals, my objective is to formulate an understanding of how Black queer subjectivity is constituted in different spaces. I argue that bodies that are queered racially and or sexually can inadvertently transform spaces by demonstrating the instability of them. Thus, the sermon by Pastor Flavio illustrated the impossibilities of Black queer attempts to line up with mainstream evangelicalism through traditional hermeneutical approaches. Despite Pastor Flavio's attempts, wonkiness ensued. I have been particularly drawn to Sarah Ahmed's use of the word wonky to describe queer effects in white and heterosexual spaces, because it is an evocative term that invites a consideration of not just physical instability, but mental and emotional as well. Unintended difficulties erupted when Pastor Flavio articulated and defended Hagar's duty of surrogacy. So Pastor Flavio, a Black gay man, preaching a sermon that extols Hagar as a willing and obedient surrogate, refuses simplistic explication. My ethnographic findings indicate that Afro-Brazilian evangelicals are not inherently subversive agents who strive to dismantle Brazilian evangelicalism and white supremacy from inside the master's house. Thus, by recognizing that agency, subversion, and disruption are not birthrights that are claimed by all sexual and gender minorities, we can formulate an understanding of how Black queer religious hermeneutics are produced both in euphonious and cacophonous registers that belie the monotony of mainstream registers of queer theory. It has not been my intention during this presentation to merely poke holes in Pastor Flavio's religious beliefs. Instead, I have considered how Afro-Brazilian evangelicals, LGBTQ evangelicals, travel in a religious space that is shaped by pervasive and persistent racism, homophobia, sexism, and white supremacist forms of structural violence in Brazilian society. Despite these realities, their material reality may be rooted in a religious and not racial or sexual understanding of selfhood or subjectivity. Thus, by unabashedly claiming a kind of evangelicalism, Pentecostalism, or conservative Christianity, despite their rejection in these religious spaces. However, their interpretive endeavors can also inadvertently reveal the inherent wonkiness of evangelicalism by illustrating the difficulties of completely aligning oneself with religion that advocates that a woman submit to rape as God's will. Therefore, their insistence on being recognized as evangelical or Pentecostal Christians has numerous ramifications. Despite the fact that LGBTQ Brazilians are in constant theological, social, and cultural battle with those around them, these evangelical Brazilians persevere, carving out a space for themselves, making an appearance at the family table, and ultimately queering Brazilian evangelicalism.
And our last panelist is Renan Quinalha from the Universidade Federal de São Paulo.
Just have to find my presentation. Acho que já está aberto.
Ah, é, aquela que você mandou. Pois é, você mandou hoje. Essa aqui, né? Isso.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. Firstly, I would like to thank Jimmy for inviting me to be at this so special event to celebrate your life, your career, your friendship, and also your fake retirement. We already agree about that here. I'm very happy to be back to Brown, where I was during 2016 to write my PhD dissertation under Jim's supervision. I wasn't able to finish the dissertation here, as Jimmy convinced me that it was more important for us to mobilize against the 2016 coup and against Lava Jato, Operation Car Wash. As you know, Jimmy is quite persuasive, and he's usually right. It was important what we did, but we didn't stop the coup. But back in Brazil, I was able to finish the thesis and then publish it as a book. Everything went all right. Today, I'd like to talk, based on the panel's proposal, about the new frontiers of queer studies in Brazil and also of the history of the dictatorship, two themes that mark Jim's political life and academic production, as well as mine. I first met Jim at 2013 LASA Congress. Maybe we have met quickly before at your birthday party in 2012 in São Paulo. I was then a young lawyer at Truth Commission of State of São Paulo who had completed a master's degree on the topic of transitional justice. Two common friends, Janaína and Edson Teles, had invited me to participate in a panel with Jimmy. There we had an immediate connection. After the panel, we talked a lot in the hotel lobby, I think more than an hour, about our common background in Trotskyism, academic interests, political activism, and personal life. He was the only person who didn't run away from me when I said I had been a PSTU activist. For those who don't know, PSTU is a radical left political party in Brazil, very well known by this message, contra burguês, vote 16. This meeting was fundamental for the professional and personal choices I have made in the years that followed and until today. At that moment, I had just came out of the closet, and it was the first time I realized I could be a gay and leftist scholar. Jim has and still is a role he was and still is a role model for me. These were times of Truth Commission in Brazil, and we started an effort to highlight the persecution of LGBT population during the dictatorship. On March 29, 2014, 10 years ago, on the weekend that marked the 50th anniversary of the coup, we held a historic public hearing in São Paulo. Entitled Homossexualidades e Ditadura no Brasil, the meeting was organized by National Truth Commission, together with the Truth Commission of the State of São Paulo, Rubens Paiva, with the aim of contributing to an analysis of relations between the Brazilian dictatorship and the homosexualities. It was quite symbolic that the old Dept building, where one of the most important repressive bodies of the dictatorship operated, and which today houses the Memorial da Resistência, had reserved the disputed date of the anniversary of the coup to discuss a topic without prestige. In the completely full auditorium, with more than 200 people, there were several activists from different generations of the Brazilian LGBT movement, interested in their own memory and history. The few studies that addressed specific aspects surrounding the repression of these segments, as well as reports of the resistance undertaken by them, were exposed and discussed that afternoon. This initiative, which included representatives from two of the country's main trade commissions, the national one in the state of São Paulo, as well as secretaries of state for culture and justice, symbolically marked a commitment by these state bodies towards the LGBT community and society in general. There, at that moment, a kind of agreement was reached in the sense that that history, until then official and visible, would come to light with the final report of these commissions. Some time later, this adjustment would be fulfilled. The National Trade Commission report included a specific chapter located in the Textos Temáticos section of Book 2, called Ditadura e Homossexualidades, made under the responsibility of Commissioner Paulo Sérgio Pinheiro, with research, investigations, and writing by James Green and by me. We also edited a book called Ditadura e Homossexualidades, published in 2014. The mobilization we promoted was important for this to happen. It's enough to mention as an example that at the National Trade Commission there was a discussion between the members to the point where one of the commissioners asked, por que esse assunto de viados? Viados vermelhos. Why this faggot issue? One of them asked, why this faggot issue should be included in the report, was the question. To give you all an idea, even with all the progress made and the work ready, up until the eve of the delivery of the material for the final report, it was not yet known whether the topic of homosexuality would deserve a specific chapter or whether it would end restricted to a few pages of a single section along with other themes such as gender and indigenous people, like less important themes of the dictatorship. This issue was only defined in the last few days, already in the preparation and the reading phase of the final report, which was delivered to President Dilma Rousseff on December 2014. This political articulation promoted by Jean was fundamental for the expansion of studies both on dictatorship and sexuality in our country. It is evident that standards of public morality did not invade the political arena with the beginning of the dictatorship. It was not this that inaugurated the discrimination against vulnerable populations that for centuries had already marked Brazilian culture, especially by the violent process of colonization. However, realizing that there has always been homophobia and transphobia among us is a truism that explains little, since it does not take into account the different historical manifestations of a regulatory power of sexual deviation and their particular characteristics in each historical situation. As the National Trade Commission pointed out during the dictatorship, states also used an ideology of intolerance that was materialized in the persecution and attempted control of groups considered to be a threat or danger. The creation of an internal enemy took advantage of not only political contours in accordance with the doctrine of national security, but also moral ones, in associating homosexuality with a form of degeneration and the corruption of the youth. The rhetoric of morality and proper manners, moralidade e bons costumes, was central to the construction of the ideological structure that supported the dictatorship. The defense of traditions, the protection of the family, and the cultivation of Christian values were all at the same time motives that animated a real repressive crusade against sectors classified as undesirable and considered threatening to the moral and sexual order. The military who led the coup with the decisive support of civil sectors, did not take long to catalyze this diffuse reactionary feeling into a cohesive discourse of more security, defense of traditions, and respect for the order that was being lost along the tortuous path of development in Brazil. Cid Furtado, a rapporteur of the draft constitutional amendment that legalized divorce, argued that development and the national security are not structured only with tractors, laboratories, or canons. Behind all of this is the family, one solidary compact, a sanctuary where father, mother, and children shape the character of nationality. I just translated what is written in Portuguese there. This sentence is perhaps one of the most perfect syntheses of the sexual policies of the dictatorship. His indignation with the divorce, in fact, referred to much deeper concerns about sexual liberation, with the greater presence of women in public space and with the visibility of homosexual and travestis. Private life, the intimate sphere, and everyday activities were also the object of the authoritarian control of the Brazilian dictatorship. As a homosexual, the person was considered less respectable in her or his dignity. Publications with erotic or pornographic material were often apprehended and incinerated in a society that consumed this type of content. Editors and journalists working in the gay media were indicted, prosecuted, and their lives were devastated, often with the support of the judicial system. Movies and theater plays were censored or banned. Musical lyrics were prevented from circulating for violating morality, especially when they made an apology for homosexuality. On television, programs suffered direct intervention by censors who cut scenes with the presence of effeminate characters who, with their simple existence, caused shame to viewers. This one lyric of a music from Luis Airão, homosexual, was also cut by the censorship. And travesties, I won't translate that word. Travesties, prostitutes, and homosexuals present in the urban ghettos were also an uncomfortable presence for the society. For this reason, they began to be persecuted, arrested, extorted, and tortured. These examples point out how sexuality and gender became a national security issue for the military. In this sense, it is in this sense that one can speak of a hetero-military dictatorship, in which there was an official sexual policy to control manifestations considered as perversions or deviations. Despite these findings, there is also a fundamental ambiguity in the late 60s and the early 70s in Brazil. Nightclubs, bars, other spaces for sociability among homosexuals grew despite the repression of the states. As long as they remained in the shadows and in the closets or in the ghettos in which they hid, homosexuals could exist and do whatever they wanted with their bodies. The problem was then when they came into light and occupied the public space claiming an existence and a political place in society. It was the homosexual and travestis belonged to the popular classes who most intensely felt the dictatorship repressive action on their body and desires. While many middle-class homosexuals, generally with a double life, participated freely in the society through the markets and through access to good employment opportunities, poor LGBT who were not so lucky were classified as vadios, vagrants, and arrested. Thus, the core of the dictatorship sexual policy was not to physically exterminate these vulnerable groups in the same way as they did with the political subversion. The objective was to reinforce the stigma against homosexuals and to desexualize the public space by expelling these segments and to force a relation between people of the same sex into the private sphere. The function of the dictatorship was to make bodies and collectives invisible so that they could not claim recognition of their rights and freedoms. So the dictatorship left fertile ground for the practice of abuse and violence against homosexuals to be committed by public agents, given the lack of limits and even the presence of incentives to do so. Thanks to this new perspective in the last 10 years, we have seen an increase in the number of workings analyzing new aspects of the dictatorship in the field of sexuality. If Além do Carnaval, as Guta said here, published in 1999, was a book that opened a field in history for LGBT studies in Brazil. The Truth Commission and Jim's work were fundamental for opening new perspectives for understanding the severity of the dictatorship in our country. As a consequence of this work, a historic opportunity was also opened to think about memory and reparation for the LGBT population in Brazil with the creation of a working group sponsored by Ministry of Human Rights. It's a kind of truth commission just for the violence against LGBT community in our history, since colonization until nowadays. We are both part of it, me and Jim, and also Benito. And right now, we are working, Jimmy and I, and Guta. It's our third book together, and this one with Guta, in a new book. And for all this, I have to thank you so much, Jim. Thanks.
Guta, Andrea, Renan, thank you for the marvelous presentations. And now we'll open it up for the next 30 minutes or so.
We need to if we need to because
Okay.
we have a lot of time for lunch. I have an hour and a half for lunch.
All right, so we have time then for a conversation.
I wanted to start out with a brief comment. There's no questions yet. I just wanted to say thank you to you three and to Jim, of course, for what I really truly believe to be groundbreaking, revolutionary, and necessary work in scholarship.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all three for presenting. It's like a comment and slash a question too, regarding how influential Jim's book was. And I want to say that it's not only for the Brazilian scholarship, but also for the Latin American scholarship. I think it's like foundational to establish that through Beyond Carnival, we can see how discourses of criminalization and medicalization were essential to understand the essence of homosexuality. And you can not only see that in Brazil, but also throughout Latin America. In that sense, I want to ask you three, well, you responded that throughout your presentations as well, but yeah, I guess I want to ask how influential was this work, not only from Jim's perspective, but also for your future scholarship, if you are planning to use Jim's scholarship as well for other projects that you have in mind, or if you really see Jim's work Beyond Carnival as influential in your scholarship, and how it helped to build Brazil's democracy regarding LGBTQ studies.
Thank you all so much for your presentations. I have a question for Renan. I was wondering, you mentioned that one sort of example of queer folks being kind of written out or censored on television in Brazil. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about that, and whether in the documents you came across, or wherever it is that you came across these stories, if their reasoning for it was overtly homophobic, or if they used other sort of reasons for keeping gay folks out of television during that time. I'd be very curious to hear more about that.
I also had a question directed towards Renan, but also open to all the speakers. You know, I think during the dictatorship era, you see there's this conflation between being gay, being a health hazard, being a subversive, an internal enemy, and whatnot. And I've heard just from kind of personal conversations with people in my own family who support Bolsonaro, for example, that I remember I had a conversation with my grandfather that he told me, oh, it was the gays that brought COVID to Brazil. I was like, do you want me to put a mask on right now? Like, what is that situation? But there's a conflation, I think, between homosexuality and all these other discourses. And I think in the 60s and 70s, it's anti-communism. And now we're seeing it develop into something else. I guess my question for you is that a phenomenon that you're also identifying right now? And how do you think that's something that we can tackle in the future? And then I also think you had a question.
Echoing Michelle's point, I just want to say how appreciative I am just to hear all of the panelists today, your individual stories and relationships with Jim and how you've come into this space and kind of embody your own. And I think that especially with this panel, I think that the nature of documenting queer stories is so intimate and personal and emotional. And this is a question for all the panelists of how you protect your peace and your mental health when recording stories of individuals whose identities may overlap with yours and, document your time through space as also a queer person, with Latin American origins.
So why don't we stop there before that list goes much farther and open it up to the panelists?
Quer começar do jeito inverso?
Como você
Okay.
quer fazer?
I can start then. Answering Joaquin's question on how I did mention how influential Jim's book was, but what I think is interesting is that I wanted to get away from it a little bit, and people suggested I do it. It's hard. It's kind of my nightstand book. Every time I'm like, I have a question. Let me look what Jim did, and he was very. He said, oh, you should do all the stuff that I didn't do because the time was constrained, money was tight, and there was a bunch of stuff that I wanted to do that I didn't. And I was like, yeah, sure. The stuff that you did is already amazing. I have to do the stuff that you didn't. But I wanted to look at Beyond Carnival. But there were things that Jim said to me that were beyond that in terms of, well, women's experiences are different. You'll not find them in the sources like I did. He used to say that, well, if I found 10 cases, you're going to find one. And it's not... And I associated that it's not a needle in a haystack. There's no haystack and there's no needle. And so in that sense, I think that I thought that Beyond Carnival was possible because also Jim was very creative. So I'm like, I need to get creative, which I wasn't. In that sense, I think that what I think that it's the thing that influenced me the most was how thoughtful and creative Jim is in weaving sort of personal stories with broader political context, which is something that we struggle with in Brazilian scholarship. That you have the theoretical chapter, and then you have the case discussion. And I was like, I don't want to do that. So in that sense, I go back to Beyond Carnival frequently and often in looking at it as a history of homosexuality, but also a way to tell history, and the way that Jim, and that's in Jim's other books as well. The way he creates a narrative, it's the thing that I admire the most. And in terms of how do I protect my mental health, and I went back straight to the time that I spent looking at medical charts and from women that were they were put in mental health institutions, and I was looking for lesbians, but what I found was way bigger than that, and it was a dissertation on its own about how women were giving their families a headache, and why not get them away from here? So women that were shopping too much and their husbands were angry with them, women who sometimes had postpartum depression and families didn't know what to do with them, were sent to those institutions. So in a way, that month was tough. I did find some cases on the lesbians and sexual deviants, but integrated with the idea of the discourse on that homosexuality was tied to problems with genes and endocrinology. But what I found was that women were surveilled 24/7, and they had little, sometimes no agency in what they could do. And the hardest thing was looking at charts that said that, well, she entered the institution in 1914, and 6 months later she was dead because of, well, tuberculosis, of what. So these women had no chance. It was hard for them to survive that environment. And now it just got dark. How did I protect it? I did have to find a way of being the thing that we can be as historians, as objective as possible, is, well, this is history, and what is my investment in it to tell the stories as I want them to be told? It is sad and it is hard, but sometimes I found histories of women who did live fulfilling lives, and those that were the ones that I wanted to look at when I was having a hard day. So and this is the thing of doing a work that encompasses the whole 20th century, is that, well, it's not being fruitful, it's being way too sad in this chapter. Let me look at the things that are nice, the women that flirted, that were in bars, that played pool. So yeah, I think that's the way that I found to do it. But thanks.
Hi, before I answer the questions, I have a message from Watufani who was originally supposed to be on the panel, but he couldn't make it. He says, I want to express my deep sadness that I cannot be with you all in person to celebrate the scholarship and legacy of Jim and all those he helped to mentor throughout the years, myself included. I remember arriving to Brown as a graduate student, excited to investigate Black LGBTQIA+ communities in Brazil and the United States, but so unsure of whether my approach was right or how I envisioned framing my project would work. That's when I met Jim, who seemed to understand the importance of expanding research on Black queer activism in Brazil. He eagerly invited me to take his Latin American historiography course, and my trajectory was forever changed. Gaining Jim as a mentor helped set me up for success, and suddenly I gained a cheerleader who believed in my capacities as a researcher, even when I was in doubt. Jim always grounded his questions about my work and how this research could be used to advance movements towards further freedoms and justice for the Black queer communities that I collaborated with. He encouraged me to constantly think about how I could open doors for other Black LGBTQIA+ scholars coming after me. To this day, I take these grounding questions that Jim passed along seriously as I make my way in my academic career. Thank you so much for these gifts, Jim, and a career full of building up scholars who are working to support a more just Brazil. So that's what I want to comment. As for the role of Beyond Carnival in my own research, when I was an undergraduate, I actually checked this morning. I did cite it in my undergraduate thesis, which I completed in 2001, so only a couple of years after the book was published. And I mean, I think it's unfortunate that even to this day, it's still needed. Beyond Carnival is needed when in discussing LGBTQ populations in Brazil. I've served as an expert witness on different asylum cases for queer Brazilians who are seeking asylum in the U.S. and in the U.K. And it's amazing how often I read, well, São Paulo has the biggest carnival parade in the world, that this is still a justification that's given by the Home Office in the UK. So unfortunately, Beyond Carnival, I think, is still necessary and is still a work that is vital. As for the how to do research on difficult situations, particularly when interacting with people, as an anthropologist, that's what I do. And while I was very emotional here, my wife says I need to blame being perimenopausal. that, you know, early in my career in doing research, especially my dissertation research, I didn't have those spaces I didn't recognize to a degree I should have, that I needed to have some separation in between my doing research and also living with people, because I lived with different lesbian households when I was doing my dissertation research. And the way that I found to separate myself was just to leave for maybe a weekend and stay at a hotel, because it was, you know, in hindsight, that was a lot of money. So I don't know if I should have been doing that as often as I did. But it's really important to do that, to take that space when you do qualitative research. And I mean, speaking of that, that's what I've appreciated a lot about Jim's work, is that even though he's a historian, he also believes in qualitative research. And as an anthropologist, I, you know, believe in history, and I try to include history in the work that I do. And, you know, Jim and I met 2005 this summer. I actually looked that up on my Hotmail account, so it was that long ago. And it was right before you started at Brown, so this is really, you know, a privilege.
Well, thank you all for the incredible questions. I don't know if I can answer all of them, but I'm going to try. The first one about the importance of the book. For me, it was really important in my work. But I think that personally also, because it was the first book I read about LGBT history. And I think one of the greatest violence against our community is being deprived of a past, of a history. So I think that this book, Jim's book, gave this sense to me, like where I came from, there were people before me, like struggling and living the desires and everything. So I'm very honored that I wrote the preface of the second edition in Brazil. And I hope that this book being more and more read there. About the question on the television, I saw and I found lots of documents em Departamento de Censura de Versões Públicas, né, also on television. In cases like Chacrinha in 1972, who was fired because he insisted in keeping like some effeminate characters in his program, the auditorium program. So I think that television was a very observed because of its the largest means of communication in Brazil at that time, like even today, I think. So there are a lot of histories about also soap operas that I found, many scenes that were cut by the censorship. So there are a lot of material, very interesting material about the censorship on television. In relation to the other question about ditadura, the dictatorship and Bolsonarismo, when I was doing my research, this PhD research, I thought that I was studying and doing a research about the history, about the past, and it was kind of very, very difficult to notice that, to realize that it was about the present also, yeah, because I was writing during, I finished in 2017, it's like almost the moment that Bolsonaro was elected in Brazil. And I'm still very scared about this similarity between these two discourses of the past and of the present. I think that this moral conservatism is very important for this project of the right-wing groups in Brazil and abroad also. So I think that it's something that we had to look at with more careful, and against what Lula said, like you don't have to remoer o passado. I don't know how to say remoer.
Chew on the past.
Revolve.
Revolve. But I think we have to do it, like because we are talking about the construction of the present, also the future. And about the last question about mental health, I don't know, but I think that I find a way of dealing with that that is very centered with the political activism, like discussing with other colleagues and friends and building like projects, common projects like with Jimmy, Guta, this Benito, this something that give us also the strength to do this work and to go ahead. So I think it's that.
Hi, I have a brief comment about Jim's influence and a question for Renan or Guta maybe. Of course, I would like to say thank you for this opportunity that you gave me and for the many lessons you learned me from you, and I will be forever grateful for this moment. And my question is, what are the possible reasons for the growing of LGBT people who sympathize with this right wing or this extreme right in Brazil, especially given the historical legacy of support from the left wing in Brazil? So I don't know, I can see sometimes in the news and the television LGBT people go to the Bolsonaro manifestations, and this is so crazy for me, so I would like to understand this a little bit. Thanks.
Hi. First of all, I'd just like to thank everyone for tolerating my daughter's presence at all the panels. You know, we're hoping she's Brown class of 2045. And you know, I know Jim will still be emeritus at that point, so I'm to guest teach some classes. Thanks for these presentations, they were really great. I have a question for Renan about the protests of police brutality at the end of the 70s that you referenced, and you referenced prostitutes, which is part of my research. So I'm curious sort of what you've come across in the archives about collaborations between travesti activists and prostitutes in that moment, and maybe again, I'm thinking like end of the 80s perhaps, and in like AIDS prevention work, like peer education models, collaborations with the Ministry of Health in the 90s maybe. So I'm curious what you've come across. Thank you.
I have a question. I am curious, so we referenced Jim's groundbreaking work at the end of the 20th century, and I'm curious as to what the development of public perception of your scholarship has been in Brazil in the last decade, in the last 20 years. So we referenced the Parada being the largest in the world. However, Brazil, as many Latin American countries, still holds very orthodox beliefs. So what has been this development of public perception, maybe for Renan or for Guta? What has been that reception of your scholarship?
I can start. I think Hannah is better equipped than I to talk about far right LGBTQ people. I just, as a personal take on that, is that as the movement expands, we do need to incorporate those people. We cannot say they're not truly LGBTQ or they're not they're wrong. They do have a political belief that sometimes clashes directly with their own identity in terms of what these people defend. But it's sometimes people say, "Oh no, we cannot listen to Tami Miranda." I'm like, we gotta take him. It's part of. If straight people need to acknowledge the horrible people that we also there is it broadens the movement politically. It makes sense that these people feel more. I hate the word tolerance, but I think that's what this is, and especially in far right movements. And they're very much interested in seeing that they're welcoming it. That so it makes sense that these people would want to feel welcomed by what they think is progressive, what they think is conservative in that case. So yeah, that's my take on that, and I sometimes I like to engage with those people because I think that's the polyphonia of political investment. In terms of the reception of my work, I still consider myself I am an early career scholar, though I did a master's in Brazil. And a lesbian doing lesbian history, I think, is perhaps it's what people expect. So I've been welcomed by the people doing LGBTQ history so far. But in several other instances, I have to say that not all has been done, because sometimes it's your fault, Jim, because you wrote a book that's so good. Sometimes people would be like, well, but people that don't get LGBTQ history, well, but that's been done. That's what else there is to say about LGBT people? They were marginalized, yeah, sure. They lived at the carnival, yeah, sure. What is there to say further? So it is well received among people that do that, but it's also a constant battle. I don't want to say battle, struggle, but reinforcing that there are other histories of sexuality to be told, that focus not in urban environment but in rural environments, that are not in the 70s but in the 30s. So and that depends on it's the needle in a haystack type of situation where you have to come across something that will allow you to tell you those stories. So in a way, it's a mix. It's nice to be among peers that get it, but it's you have to, in those situations, you have to gain strength and courage to actually put up with the harder battles.
Thank you, Guta. I also want to direct my question at Andrea because you touched so much on religion, so I just wanted to make sure you.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to comment on the question about LGBTQ Bolsonaro supporters. It's interesting. I've interviewed, I think since 2019 and last year, probably maybe 50 people, and of those people, 3 voted for Bolsonaro. 1 was the mother of a lesbian couple, and 2 were gay men. And during the interview, particularly in one interview, the way that one of the men was answering questions, he answered in some of the questions in a way that foregrounded sort of conservative understandings of the economy and sort of very individualistic ways of answering the questions. And so I knew I needed to be careful in asking him about Bolsonaro, because I didn't want to ask him a leading question. And so when I asked about the election, he said he voted for Bolsonaro, and the reason he gave, which was the same as the other gay man, was because of PT corruption, which to me is like, Bolsonaro is so corrupt. But for them, it was solely about PT corruption, and they weren't voting for Bolsonaro, they were voting for his party. They understood that he was a fool, but they also wanted to, indicate their displeasure with PT and their overall, I would say, affinity towards his party. I think that's important to think about, that it's not only far-right LGBTQ supporters of Bolsonaro, but you also have people, and I think other people who are not queer, who are in that space of a continual displeasure with PT.
It's difficult to answer to this question with Jimmy in audience. Maybe you can talk, Jim, and help us to answer. Leo, why this LGBT right-wing? Or I think after pure right-wing, we have to understand also this LGBT right-wing also. Like it's something that show us. I think that this voting motivation is very complex. It's not only about your sexual orientation or gender identity. We have a set of identities that cross us, and I think that for many people, the class identity is more important than the being part of the community. They don't feel part of the LGBT community. It's like something that he lives his desire, or she lives her desire, and don't think about this. in political terms, but it's political, yeah. So I think that we have to understand this very complex motivation for voting and for being part of a political project. About the public perception in Brazil for these subjects, I think that it's growing, the acceptance of it, and I think that our generation, me and Guta, it's like the first generation. I don't know if Benito agree with us, because Benito studied other things during the PhD and before, yeah, and we are the first generation that in Brazil that can, like, I changed also the subject of my PhD thesis dissertation to this issue of sexuality, like in the middle of the process after knowing Jim, that I started working with it. And I think that we are the first generation that can study this and being recognized as an academic and being part of the university and like a serious work about it.
And that has people to exchange with in terms of that can have like a field to talk to and that respond to.
Yeah, I think that it's getting stronger, and it's very interesting to see that. Like Benito has a group in the south, Federal do Rio Grande do Sul. I'm a Federal de São Paulo. I'm always being invited to give talks in other places in Brazil and being part of the committees of PhD dissertation or master. So I think it's really growing these last years, and thanks to this, além do Carnaval and this political activism and academic activism that Jim was doing during the 90s and after I think this last decade mainly. It's curious because another professor I had, anthropology at USP, who studied this like some way, Júlio Simões, he talked to me like, no, it's not a good idea to study this right now. Like it made more traditional way of your PhD with another transitional just, for example. It was my master's degree subjects, and he said me that like it's not okay to study this yet in Brazil, but I think that it changed. It was the beginnings of the 2000. And about this question on prostitutes and travesties is a very interesting question, because both groups they had like few support of the traditional left political parties, and you have some very important people that supported, but like Eduardo Suplicy at that moment, like Ruth Escobar, and they were Irma Passoni, representatives of São Paulo, Fernando Moraes, for example, people who supported this mobilization at that moment of prostitutes and travestis, because they were the same for black people, like in this ghetto, the central area of São Paulo that I showed here in the presentation, some pictures. They were the same, they suffered the same violence by the state and dictatorship, and after the dictatorship continued against these sectors. So we have very interesting pictures of this moment and demonstrations that a prostitute organized and people from the LGBT movement were present, and the same thing happened like when the LGBT movement had this kind of mobilization, but prostitutes were they related. Marisa Fernandes tells this in an article, that book that we organized. She says that prostitutes were scared about being in the street like during the day, because it was really difficult for them to be accepted even in this sector. This identity travesti was not so consolidated at that moment also. So we had more this homosexual support with the prostitutes at this moment in Brazil.
Okay. Well, I think that we are then ready for lunch, so it's
For her.